And to speak on this, it is Dr. Sunil Taneja, Professor of Hepatology at PGI Chandigarh. He's a very bright, brilliant, young, dynamic, and very cerebral hepatologist of the nations with multiple publications to his credit, and he's doing yeoman's job. Dr. Taneja, please make us learn.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the kind introduction. And I'm going to talk about molecular pathogenesis of HCC and its impact on clinical practice. We all know that HCC is the 5th most common tumor worldwide, and it is the 3rd most common cause of cancer-related mortality worldwide. We are also aware that HCC is a complex biological process in which the diagnosis is often delayed, and by the time diagnosis is made, no effective treatment is available. We are able to treat around 30 to 40% of patients of HCC only. And if you look at the incidence of HCC, there is a high prevalence in East Asia as well as in Sub-Saharan Africa. And if you look at the etiology of HCC, alcohol, Hep B and Hep C constitute the major etiology of HCC, followed by NASH, which is becoming very important and an upcoming cause of HCC. So there are several different signaling and molecular mechanisms which initiate and promote HCC. And over the next 10 minutes or so, I will take you through this. What is the molecular signaling pathways which affect the clinical outcome of patients of HCC? So before I really take you through the micro signaling pathways, let me just tell you, why do patients with liver disease go on to develop HCC? And once you have hepatocyte injury by various factors like hepatitis B, C, alcohol, or aflatoxin B, there is a process of necrosis and proliferation, and this goes on as a continuous cycle leading to stellate cell activation and formation of abnormal liver nodules, which you call as cirrhotic nodules, and with extensive collagen formation leading to development of cirrhosis. So once cirrhosis sets in and you have these hyperplastic nodules, there is a transformation because of various molecular pathways, dysregulation of the various molecular pathways, and because of genetic changes, which leads to development of dysplastic nodules, and subsequently to the development of hepatocellular carcinoma, which can be well differentiated, moderately differentiated, or poorly differentiated. However, all the causes of HCC do not go through this stage of cirrhosis. And for example, hepatitis B, in this, the virus gets integrated into the host genome and directly can lead to proliferation and loss of growth control and development of HCC. And if you look at aflatoxin B1, it can directly cause P3 gene mutation inactivation and leading to proliferation and loss of growth control, and again, development of HCC. So let's look at the milestones in the pathogenesis of HCC. In early 90s and in early 80s, I would say, there was advancement in the understanding of pathogenesis of HCC, and we were able to identify the genetic drivers of HCC, especially the P53 gene mutation and the beta-catenin gene, which is a proto-oncogene and leads to development of HCC. But then it took us around 15 years to really define the molecular classification or molecular signatures of HCC. Beyond that, now in 2016 to 2018, we have now multiple drugs which have been targeted against these molecular signatures and have become the standard of care for advanced HCC. So as I said, pathogenesis is a multi-step process. There is a progressive accumulation of molecular alterations pinpointing different molecular and cellular events. And this has been possible because of the next generation sequencing assays which are available now globally, and we are able to molecular landscape the complete genome of HCC. Earlier to this, we were using mouse models, and that is why we were not able to completely sequence the genome, and we were not able to identify the molecular signatures. So the pathogenesis primarily involves the 3 genomic alterations. Second is the epigenetic modifications, and third is the growth receptor pathways. Genomic alterations can primarily affect the development of HCC either by gene mutations, in which the TERT promoter or the TP53, which is the tumor suppressor gene, primarily plays a role. You can also have gene amplification or deletions, and there are a host of gene amplification and deletions which can lead to development of HCCs. So what are the epigenetic modifications which can lead to development of HCC? Primarily, it is the DNA methylation. You also have microRNAs, which are small non-coding RNAs that regulate the translation of many genes. You also have long non-coding RNAs that regulate gene expression and protein synthesis. Dysregulated epigenetics contribute to carcinogenesis by influencing multiple mechanisms, including gene transcription, chromosomal stability, and cell differentiation. So this is the main pathway which primarily plays a role in hepatitis B virus-related HCC. Once you have dysregulation of the DNA methylation machinery, either you have global DNA hypomethylation or you have gene-specific DNA hypermethylation, which leads to chromosomal instability, proto-oncogene activation, or tumor pressure gene inactivation, leading to development of HCC. The growth factor pathways are the most important pathways which have been recently recognized, and most of the drug therapy has been directed against these growth factor pathway alterations. And the major signaling pathways involved in this are the tyrosine kinase pathways, which are regulated by multiple factors, including the EGF, HGF, FGF, and vascular endothelial growth factor. You also have other pathways, including the Wnt B-catenin pathway, IGF beta, TGF beta also, and the Hedgehog pathway, which plays an important role in the pathogenesis of HCC. So let us look at these receptors which are there, which are involved in this tyrosine kinase pathway. Multiple receptors can be activated, and c-Met also is involved in this. By this activation of these pathway of these receptors, you can down-regulate or up-regulate the various signaling pathways, including the mTOR pathway, the JAK-STAT pathway, or the RAS-RAF kinase pathways. And you also have this Wnt-catenin pathway, in which the proto-oncogene was identified way back in 90s. All these can act through different pathways, and they can be a combination of these pathways, which can lead to differentiation, proliferation of the tumor cells, and development or progression of HCC. So as I told you in the previous slide, there are the 4 different pathways which have been identified, and recently the immune pathway has also been recognized. This is based on the activation of the T cells, and if you are able to control the T cell function, and which gets suppressed in case of a tumor, then you can prevent the progression, or you can also control the tumor progression as well as the development of HCC. So just a word about receptor tyrosine kinase pathways, which is the most important pathway against which a number of therapies have been developed. There are multiple receptors that activate multiple downstream signals in the receptor tyrosine pathways. As I said earlier, you have the EGF, FGF, HGF, and c-KIT, platelet-derived growth factor, and VEGF factors. And all these factors ultimately can cause activation of mTOR, JAK2, RAS, RAF pathway, and lead to development of HCC. VEGF is again a very important pathway against which a number of drugs are being developed now. And we all know that liver is a highly vascular organ, which depends on effective angiogenesis for cellular regeneration. And efficient angiogenesis is critical for tumor growth, vascular invasion, and metastasis. And VEGF is a critical angiogenic factor that plays an important regulatory role in HCC. So disease recurrence, poor prognosis after resection, vascular invasion, and portal vein embolization are often correlated to high expression of VEGF. We have drugs which are now available against the VEGF, and this anti-angiogenic treatment is being used now. And once you can control the vascular normalization and progression of this vascular channels, then there is a role of immune checkpoint inhibitors, and this combination has recently been approved as first-line treatment for management of HCC. What about Wnt-catenin pathway? This is a very important signaling pathway and one of the most commonly disrupted pathways in HCC. And it is implicated in embryogenesis, differentiation, cell proliferation, and tumorigenesis. These are the members of the Wnt-catenin signal pathway found to be altered in human HCC. Either you can have an overexpression and underexpression, which downregulates the receptors and leads to the development of HCC. A word about RAS signaling pathway. This is the most well-characterized proto-oncogene in human cancers, and it is involved in the apoptosis and proliferation, and dysregulation again leads to the development of HCC. JAK-STAT pathway, STATs are activated by a variety of cytokines, hormones, and growth factors. And activated STAT stimulates the transcription of suppressor of cytokine signaling genes. And this JAK stimulation of STAT activates cell proliferation, migration, differentiation, and apoptosis. And if this gets dysregulated because of inhibitors, this can again lead to the development of HCC tumor proliferation as well. So moving on to the immune suppression and immune escape mechanisms, HCC tumor microenvironment has a complex interplay of T cells, B cells, macrophages, and hepatic cells, and they try to evade the immune surveillance by activating multiple cellular signaling cascades. In tumors, it has been found that there is a presence of CD8 cells, which is associated with a better outcome, and whereas the presence of regulatory T cells, that is TREGs, is correlated with poor prognosis. And there are studies in which the immunocytochemical analysis have been done in HCC patients, where it has been shown that increased expression of PD-1 or PD-L1 promotes CD8 T cells and apoptosis and contributes to tumor evasion. So the concept of this has been used for development of checkpoint inhibitors and blocking of the checkpoint molecules that block immune response against tumor cells have been increasingly recognized as an effective therapeutic approach in HCC. So what are these checkpoints? Checkpoints are immunological breaks by which a cancer suppresses the immune response. Inhibition of this immune checkpoints enhance anti-tumor immune response, and checkpoint inhibitors have already been approved for various treatment of cancers. They started with melanoma, and these drugs have now been approved for HCC also. Pembrolizumab and nivolumab have been approved as second-line drugs, and there are various other drug trials which are going on checkpoint inhibitors for treatment of HCC. So this is the recently approved drug combination, which has been which is the first-line drug for now advanced HCC. The combination of atezolizumab and bevacizumab. Atezolizumab is a PD-L1 inhibitor, and bevacizumab is VEGF inhibitor, and this combination has shown excellent result in a recently published trial in NEJM. So what are the milestones in targeted therapies? The first drug which was approved for HCC is sorafenib way back in 2007. And subsequent to this, there are multiple trials which were negative and did not show benefit in HCC. And recently we have lenvatinib, which has been approved as first and second line drug. The second line drugs which have also been approved include regorafenib, cabozantinib, and ramucirumab, which will be discussed by the subsequent speaker. So how do these molecules act? These are all multi-kinase inhibitors, and look at sorafenib, it acts at multiple levels. Same is the case for other drugs like lenvatinib and regorafenib also. And all these try to prevent or activate the molecular signaling pathways which are dysregulated in HCC and trying to stop the progression of the disease. So just to show you this very important BCLC staging before I summarize, let's focus on the systemic therapy. There are a host of drugs which are now available as first, second, and third line drugs. And these are all targeted therapies against the molecular signatures which I have shown you earlier. Now, let me just focus on what is there in the future. Look at these three boxes. Multiple trials are going on the combination of these drugs, either with checkpoint inhibitors or with the local regional therapies. And I hope that the combination therapy is the future of HCC, and we will be able to take care of HCC in future by these wonderful combinations which are in the pipeline. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to summarize by saying that hepatocarcinogenesis is a complex biological process. Several challenges are still there to apply the knowledge of molecular pathogenesis in care of patients. Combination therapy is the way forward. And with further discovery of molecular subclasses, we can hopefully identify more homogeneous subgroups that can specifically target for drug development. Thank you very much for your patient listening.
Thank you, Dr. Taneja, for summarizing the whole progress in molecular drivers and the targets for them. I will request all co-chairpersons to take the question at the last in the chat box, and I will request other co-chairperson to start introducing the other topics. I will request Dr. Arvind Soin, Professor Arvind Soin. Sorry, sir. Professor Arvind Soin to introduce, and I may be excused. I have to leave this because I have to join Hall A for a debate. Thank you very much. Nice listening to you, Dr. Sunil. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Acharya. You are the actual big professor. We are all your students. Anyway, so now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gagan Saini. He is the radiation oncology head at Max Super Specialty Hospital. So Dr. Saini will now talk about the role of SBRT in HCC. So Dr. Saini.
Thank you, Dr. Soin. Thank you, INSL.
The screen is all yours.
Yeah, but the screen is showing Dr. Taneja's slide. Oh yeah, it's gone now. So I'm going to share mine now. So the topic of my discourse today is about role of SBRT in various stages of HCC. I thank Dr. Madan and chairpersons and INSL for having me here. Slides will take a while to start moving, I guess. So staging in HCC is very interesting, especially for an oncologist, because I really find it fascinating that the most common staging system, BCLC, not just has the sizes and other things, it also has the functionality incorporated into it, and that's very fascinating. But we all know that in the clinic, the evaluation starts with whether the patient is resectable or not. And then, the patients are generally relegated to the local therapies, which are generally empirical. And with empirical, what it means is that what is available locally in the institution, in the city, in the country. So that is where all these understandings and the fine nuanced points of all the local therapies of, say, RFATs, other embolization, and now SBRT and TARE comes in. I shall be speaking of SBRT. But before I go ahead, I would like you to understand, what SBRT is, maybe not in the full sense, but certainly in some sense. Many a times I'm asked that, how are you giving radiation to the whole liver and, getting away with it? But we are not giving radiation to the whole liver. Just want you to know that if this is the HCC that, requires addressal with SBRT, SBRT is going to do something like this to focus the radiation only to that part, and the remaining part will get either no dose or very limited or acceptable dose. The mental image I want you to leave with is that this tumor, which is bang in the center of the liver, is getting the required dose, but outside the dose is not so relevant, not so high, not so critical. But that's what I want you to leave with. So SBRT is not burning the tumor, it's killing the tumor biologically by causing double-strand break, microvascular damage, immune pathway inhibition or activation, and signal transduction pathways. It's a highly radiosensitive tumor. It is not a radioresistant tumor. This is what the older textbooks may have written about it. This is a radiobiological data which shows that HCC is a radiosensitive tumor. So we have a tumor that's radiosensitive and a technology that is precise. And that is where the success of SBRT begins. Go back to the same slide, first slide, and we start the discussion. We'll break it into a few parts, how it started, small HCCs, large HCCs, FAQs if possible, and conclusions. How did it start? Mendez Romero in 2006 did something like a phase 1 study. And they took some patients, they gave some SBRT to those patients by appropriate institutional protocol, which were ethically approved. And they found a local control rate of 75%. That was very exciting. And then some other people also followed suit. And what we got was a dose finding sort of a phase of a phase trial. And this is the reason why we are in phase 2, phase 3 sort of a situation with SBRT. So we start with what is the role of SBRT in small tumors. We start with basic role of SBRT with results. These are some retrospective studies, some patients which have been retrospectively analyzed or have been separated of a smaller size. This part of the discussion is for small HCCs, and SBRT is giving a local control of 85 to 90% after 3 years for small HCCs. So what is the definition of small HCC? What is the size of small HCCs? Now we all would be a little bit perplexed by it. For all practical purposes, 5 centimeter or less would be a small HCC. The 3-year overall survival can be anything between 40 to 70%. And this is variable not because of the local control. It is variable because of the higher or lower CP scores in different patients or with higher sizes. So within the small HCC, higher the size, the worse will be the outcome. So a bad liver or a higher tumor. So at the end of the day, what are we doing with the SBRT or TACE or TARE? We are just prolonging the function of the liver because we can't transplant it. So that is where the biology is playing. So how is SBRT vis-a-vis RFA? RFA is a highly established technology with lots of good data supporting it. So what I'm trying to make you understand is that where does SBRT fit in for a small HCC category? 224 patients published in 2016 retrospective. They did RFA and SBRT in the same department. They found SBRT was better. They further went deeper and they found that the benefit actually started when the size was higher, say about more than 3 centimeter. They found that SBRT benefit was statistically significantly better in multivariate analysis, but only when the size was higher. So other papers, published by Kim, Pan, and Lee. Most of the papers come from China and Korea, by the way. Long story short, there is benefit of SBRT, but when the tumor is larger in the smaller HCC category or it's recurrent, there's some biological consideration or something like that. So yes, there is a lot of role of SBRT. We must thread out whether the patient is beneficial with the RFA or then think about SBRT equally seriously. SBRT versus TACE, very limited data for small HCCs, but then the results of TACE and SBRT are similar. So importantly, we can go in for moderately advanced tumors. We can go in for RFA, unsuitable. And we can definitely go in for SBRT or TACE as a bridge to transplant because both have similar efficacy. There's no need to choose one over the other. SBRT plus TACE, probably biological benefit would be expected because HCCs are diffuse lesions and there's a probability of failure beyond obvious limits, and then TACE covers for the same. And also, very importantly, the mechanism of action for TACE and SBRT is separate from each other. And that is where they are complementary. But for a small HCC, that's the question for this subsection. Perhaps the benefit is not much because this is a small size and perhaps one of the therapy works. So SBRT plus TACE will improve local control rate with necrosis and all, but probably no benefit in OS. And maybe one modality can be kept for reserve. But if you're not sure if this is moderately large, for the lack of better data, combined treatment may be offered. We go to a large HCC, the most contentious point. We start with portal venous thrombus, 30 to 40% incidence in advanced HCC. Outcomes are dismal because of portal venous thrombus because the portal blood supply gets disrupted, and that's the blood supply keeping the rest of the poor liver alive, and that leads to deterioration of liver function. So it's a very important concern, and this is one of the reasons why patients deteriorate. It's a powerful prognosticator nonetheless, PVT. So one of the earliest studies in 2006 reported that the recanalization rate with RT was about 75%. And this 75-70% has been consistent since then. They found that as the response was better, the statistically significant benefit accrued. This is another paper. Complete response rates 36.6, partial 39. Again, that 70-75% category. They found that the moment the patients became responders, the benefit, the quality, the overall survival benefit kicked in, and that was statistically significant. And this graph is from the same paper. Again, lots of other studies, 70-75% of response rates can be kept as a ballpark number and can be derived from all these studies. So SBRT for portal venous tumor thrombus leads to effective local regional treatment, which has a consistent benefit in survival. Very important tool for the tumor board. For large HCCs, it is going to give you survival benefit, but a contraindication is acute hepatic insufficiency or an overall high CP status, because the CP status will be too high that even that limited radiation dose can deteriorate the liver. SBRT plus TACE, this is where the benefit will be there. Apart from the biological benefit that I talked about a while back, there is also physical benefit because TACE has limitation. There is shunting, there is recanalization, and for this reason, sometimes we have refractory HCCs, and therefore SBRT is a complementary modality. So we understood how It was a biological compatibility, also physical compatibility. These are these are star partners, so to say. So, so how does the benefit come in? So there are lots of data of SBRT with TACE, but how to understand whether SBRT and TACE together are working? For that, let me take you to the meta-analysis and systematic review. So in this systematic review and meta-analysis, what we can see is that odds ratio is 4.47 to improve 5-year survival. That means there is a statistically significant chance of improving 5-year overall survival. That is 4.47 times when you are using TACE with SBRT than you are using TACE alone. So these are the benefits that you accrue when you are using two complementary therapies. The chances of improving the tumor CR is complete response, are 2.5 times with TACE and SBRT than with TACE alone. That is just to make you understand what this data says. Other data, similar benefits, statistically significant. So that established, perhaps there is no reason to debate whether we use SBRT with TACE or not. We should use it. But should we use it as a planned SBRT or should we use it upon progression? That's a question which is asked often. We talked about how it should be for small tumors. We can use it upon progression sometimes. But then what should it be for larger tumors? This retrospective study where SBRT was given to all patients following TACE within 2 years, and they found that when it was given as an adjuvant, that is as planned, you do TACE, you do immediately do SBRT, the statistically significantly higher benefit in CR was there. And this benefit was not just for CR, it was also for overall survival, statistically significant benefit. So yes, for all practical purposes, if you're dealing with a large HCC, think about both modalities, think of one after the other. But then what first, SBRT or TACE? This retrospective paper, 3 groups, A, B, and C. A had SBRT followed by TACE, B TACE followed by SBRT, group C only SBRT. Benefits, A and B did better than C. And again, just for remembrance, the 70% PVTT response is again clearly seen, 70% ballpark. So statistically significant benefit in A and B more than C. So you should do both and you can do any before. This paper published last year in 2020 in IGROBP, which is like the NAJM for radiation oncologists. And here they did a very interesting fact-finding study, dose-finding study. They gave SBRTs and within 1 day they did TACE, just 1 dose of SBRT. And what they have reported is just safety. This is very early study. You can see as the dose is increasing, the CR rates are increasing. So perhaps the sensitization or the hyperemia caused by SBRT is helping TACE. This, of course, is topic for the future, but certainly there is a lot of complementary thing going on. We have talked about these data. We'll move to the next slide. In large tumors, there's a bridge to transplant. With all this, amazing data of SBRT causing this response in large tumors, indeed, it's a bridge to transplant. To add a cherry on the top, this one study found pathological CR rates of 27% post patients receiving transplant with SBRT. So, this one paper talked about how responders to SBRT do better, and this can be used as a biological selection tool, which is used by some departments, even in Delhi. So SBRT maintains a local control with average 70% response rates and helps in bridging for transplant and perhaps also helps in biological selection. So it's an important tool in bridge to transplant. Quickly coming to FAQs, these are some patient questions which are asked again and again in every tumor board by different people. So what is the maximum size of tumor for SBRT? Roughly 8 centimeter is the ballpark which is accepted these days. But size is really not the most important criteria for the radiation oncologist. And I take you to this paper, retrospective study, where they divided, retrospective analyzed and divided less than 4 centimeter, 4 to 10, more than 10. And they found that the CR rates were 77% with less than 4 and 45% with 4 to 10, and a very small percentage with more than 10%. But that's not the whole story, because whatever benefit we are getting, even with a large tumor, is going to help the patient live a slightly longer life. And for that, I take you to the next part of the experiment, the partial response rates. So you see more than 10 centimeter patient, there is a 61.76% partial response rate. This partial response rate is going to help the patient. This 45% response of 4 to 10 is going to help the patient. So what is going to help the patient? A response rate without deterioration of liver function. And that is where good planning by radiation oncology comes in. So how do we do that? This is another FAQ that, how do you make sure? So, in my mind as a gastroenterologist, I feel that the radiation is going to the entire liver. So how am I, really understanding and bringing it down? So we do that by these dose volume constraints. So these are either incorporated into the system or they are incorporated into the workstation. And this V is the volume, D is the doses, and these complex dose volume constraints are the ones which guide us to keep the dose volume low. But it's not so simple. Now it's much more, critical. We have these type of tables. So this planned prescription dose, which the radiation oncologist is going to have, then this first available data of mean liver dose through simulation. This is simulation is done on the computer planning system with 3-dimensional distribution of doses. And with this data available, we do what is called as a V effective calculation, liver V effective. We started doing this since the last 2 years. And these 3 things help us understand the possibility of RILD, and therefore we can change the dose to a more safer level. To put it in a single parameter, as the V effective is increasing, we can decrease the dose and keep the possibility of RILD, that is radiation-induced liver disease, to less than 5%, which is a safe number. And that's what we want, right? So another FAQ, does it work for all CP stages? Does it work for all patients? Well, we instinctively know that it doesn't, but then what does the data say? The data says that there is a statistically significant benefit when the patient is B7 or below, and it worsens when it's B10, B8 or higher. So that is the science which is helping us. FAQs, the answer to this is that when we are at B6, B7, we are perhaps the best. Of course, childhood A is even better, but we shouldn't go beyond B7, maybe up to B8, not more than that. Another FAQ, SBRT or SIRT or TARE. This is not a debate. We're just bringing forward some facts. So this is a paper, SEER database. They had compared SBRT with TARE, and they found that survival was same and disease-specific survival was same. So please try to understand that these are not 2 tablets or 2 drugs given to 2 populations and then results being published. These are patients which were chosen for their loco-regional concerns and perceived loco-regional benefits. So what I would say that this data tells me that whether it is SBRT or whether it is TARE, when you are choosing your patients well, the outcomes are similar. That is what is the important takeaway. So comparing SBRT with TARE, response rates are same, survivals are same, toxicity profile is also same. Yes, we can take it in some other forum perhaps, but yes, toxicity profile is the same. Then we do have a better and more reliable response in portal venous thrombus with SBRT, and that leads to survival benefit, as has been emphasized. But however, this does bring a scope of synergistic benefit of use of both modalities, which is being done by some centers around the world and definitely in India and Delhi. A TARE unfortunately costs a lot, and that is a deterrent sometimes. So this is my last slide, conclusions, suggestions of RT-SBRT in PCLC algorithm. This is the PCLC algorithm, and SBRT can be used when the patients are unsuitable for resection and as a bridge to transplant, or when they're unsuitable for transplant, or for when they're unsuitable for RFA or local ablative therapies. Definitive RT is an option. I have supported all this with data previously. RT is definitely relevant as a bridge to transplant for smaller size HCCs, for slightly larger patients, large HCCs, along with TACE, or when this refractory to TACE, when it's unsuitable for TACE, so TACE and SBRT, or TACE alone, or SBRT alone. So on and so forth. So these combinations have been discussed. It's quite empirical that way. With portal invasion along with sorafenib, so this is where SBRT is benefiting. And definitely for stage D, low dose RT can benefit for local palliation. It would be relevant to use it sometimes, but not all the times. And with this, I thank you for having me here. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Dr. Saini, for a very comprehensive talk on SBRT. We will have some questions for you at the end. I request Dr. Anand to introduce Dr. Naveen Kalra for his next talk. Dr. Anand, we can't hear you. You're on mute.
Yeah, so now you can hear?
Yes.
Yeah, so thank you very much for inviting me here. And I have great pleasure in inviting Dr. Naveen Kalra for giving a perspective on the non-surgical management of hepatocellular carcinoma. We just heard the options of SBRT and TARE, but we have many other options of local treatment in hepatocellular carcinoma. And Dr. Naveen Kalra is going to discuss about RFA, MWA, and electroporation. So let's see how we can together work to find out sometime a multimodality local treatments also is possible, and sometimes one modality may be better for some patient and another modality for another. And therefore, such kind of meetings will be a great help to find out which is the best modality for a particular patient for non-surgical management. I invite now Dr. Naveen Kalra, please, to take over.
Thank you, sir. And am I audible? I hope my
Yes,
slides
yes.
are
Yes.
visible too. Yeah, thank you, sir. And good evening, everyone. At the outset, I'd like to thank INAZL for having me here. I'd also like to thank Dr. Kaushal for inviting me for this talk. So I'll be going through the RFA, microwave, and electroporation, how they play a role in HCC management. So I have no financial disclosures. Part of this we've already heard right from the initial slides by the previous two speakers. So surgery definitely is the treatment of choice, but 70 to 90% of HCCs are unsuitable for resection due to extensive intrahepatic tumor involvement, extrahepatic disease, and poor liver reserve. So ablation involves the use of chemicals, whether they be thermal or non-thermal energy, delivered via electrodes directly to the tumor to achieve necrosis. So we've heard about the PCLC before the staging system, and that's what we fall back upon to select our patients who would qualify for doing ablation. So it's the very early stage BCLC patients or the early stage BCLC patients who qualify for ablation. And they are tumors less than 2 centimeters or 2 to 3 tumors less than 3 centimeters in size. This is the classification of the ablative therapies available with us. And as we can see, RFA and microwave ablation fall in the thermal ablation category, and irreversible electroporation falls in the category of non-chemical, non-thermal ablation. I'll be showing you patients in which we did each of these procedures, and I'll also, along with that, tell you how the procedure works. So this is a 65-year-old male patient, HCV positive, and as you can appreciate, this is a cirrhotic liver, and this is a hypervascular lesion with washout and a capsule surrounding it in the venous phase. And we decided to do RFA in this patient, and this is the generator that delivers the energy, and that's the pump which pushes in cold saline. If we are using a cool tip electrodes, it's a single tip, and you can use a cluster tip as well. And that's the grounding pads we need to use in case we are using a monopolar probe. So RFA, how does it work? High frequency alternating current. As you can see in this cartoon, the probe is put into the tumor. The ions are made to oscillate in the tumor, generate frictional heat, and that is how the tumor gets ablated. And because of the cirrhotic liver, it kind of creates an oven effect, doesn't let the heat go out. So we have a relatively controlled area of ablation. We do our procedures under conscious sedation, though some intervention radiologists prefer general anesthesia. So this is the probe into the tumor, and that's the gases being generated during the ablation. And there's the 3 months follow-up where we see the tumor. The arterial phase does not show any kind of residual tumor here. The 6-month follow-up, there is no recurrence here. The tumor has actually shrunken in size. And then at 1 year, we see some nodularity appearing at the periphery of the tumor, which indicates local recurrence. So moving now to the next case, you can appreciate again a focal lesion in the liver. But here you can notice that this lesion is close to the vessels, close to the hepatic veins. So what would happen in such a situation? As you can appreciate on the ultrasound image as well, we see this is the vessel hepatic vein close to the tumor. So if we put in the heat treatment here, the vessel will take the heat away, and there will be heat sink effect. So in this patient, we prefer to do microwave ablation, and that's the microwave applicator, and that's the generator that we use for giving microwave ablation. How does the microwave ablation work? They are electromagnetic waves, and they have frequencies more than 915 megahertz. To use lower frequency megahertz, there is deeper penetration and larger ablation zones. And microwave causes this electric dipoles of the water molecules, and they align to the changing fields, and then the neighboring macromolecules are heated by convection. The best heating effect is achieved in tissues with a high content of water. We do our procedure under conscious sedation, though it can be also done under general anesthesia. So this is the applicator put into the tumor, and that's the gaseous shadows because of the ablation that is happening. And that is the 1 month follow-up scan of this patient. You can see a large area of ablation. We do not see the tumor. And this is the coronal reconstruction showing the large area of ablation close to the hepatic vein, and there is no tumor whatsoever. This is the 3 months follow-up. Again, we can appreciate that there is no local recurrence, and the tumor size has begun to shrink in size. So if you compare RFA with microwave ablation, so because microwave ablation, a lot of people are trying to opt for it. So let's see how it works. The RFA, it's electric current. You need grounding pads. They can be tissue charring, reducing, resulting in increased impedance, lower intratumoral temperatures, unpredictable ablation zone, heat sink effect that I talked about, more procedural time, less ablation volume. On the other hand, microwave ablation is electromagnetic energy, no grounding pads needed. There's more homogeneous heating, higher intratumoral temperature, more predictable ablation zone, simultaneous treatment of multiple lesions, shorter procedure time, and large ablation volume. In case a patient has a pacemaker in situ, you cannot do RFA, you would prefer doing microwave ablation. So the advantages to single them out, higher intratumoral temperature, larger tumor ablation volume, faster ablation time, improved convection profile, and lower risk of heat sink effect seen with microwave ablation. Both these technologies have have adverse effects in the form of hemorrhage, infection, abscess, visceral organ injury, liver failure, pneumothorax, and skin burns, especially with radiofrequency ablation. So looking at the results, so if we want to compare RF with microwave ablation, the results regarding local disease control are controversial. There are studies, some which show that the ablation rate is better with microwave ablation. There are others which show it is better with radiofrequency ablation. As far as local recurrences are concerned, similarly, there are some studies which show that microwave ablation would have lower local recurrences. There are others which show that they would have more local recurrences. So there is kind of heterogeneous data as far as microwave versus RFA is concerned. But when we come to overall survival and complication rates, they are the same. So this brings us to this kind of conclusion that RCTs have failed to show any oncological benefit of microwave ablation over RFA. This is an interesting commentary published recently which says microwave versus RFA and HCC, which one is superior, are they equivalent? So we will never know that. So even because it's not only the system that you use for each technology, it's also what imaging you are using for guidance. So there are studies to show that ultrasound can reduce the risk of local tumor progression because it's a real-time technology and can show you the actual ablation going on. A meta-analysis which looked at radiofrequency ablation versus microwave ablation for early stage HCC. So this looked at 5 RCTs and 21 cohorts, and they found that 17.6% patients exhibited progression during follow-up in the microwave ablation group compared with 19.5% in the RFA group. So this was not significant. So no statistically significant differences were observed between microwave ablation and RFA group in terms of overall survival and disease-free survival as well. So to conclude, these authors have come with this one: microwave ablation exhibited similar therapeutic effects as RFA in the treatment of early stage HCC. Moving now to the other technology, that is electroporation. So irreversible electroporation, it's a non-thermal technique that uses high voltage current to induce cell death. It works by creating nanopores or holes in the cell membrane using the electric voltage, and this results in permeability of the cells. The cells become leaky, the contents come out, and apoptosis sets in, which means the body's own macrophages, they come in and gobble up the cells. So you finally, what we achieve is that the lesion could theoretically disappear. So the good thing about IRE is that spares the normal connective tissue framework, which means that the vital structures escape injury. So IRE is thus done as an alternative to thermal ablation in the same stage of HCC cancers, but for lesions which are located close to the vital structures. So this is a patient whom we chose to do IRE, and why? Because you can see here a hypervascular tumor sitting right at the hilum. So it is close to the hepatic arteries, the right and left hepatic arteries, and that's the coronal reconstruction, which shows that it is close to the portal vein as well. So it's sitting right at the hilum. So in this case, we would definitely prefer IRE and not the thermal ablation. So that's the generator, that's the ECG synchronizer. And those are the 18 gauge probes, 15 centimeter long, which are used to place within the tumor. So using the anterior approach under CT guidance, parallel probes are placed into the tumor, and that's what we did under general anesthesia and under CT guidance. But it is important to be very accurate and precise in the placement of these needles. So they cannot be closer than 1 centimeter. They cannot be further apart than 2.5 centimeters. So once, like a marksman, you've placed your probes, you deliver the energy, and that's what you achieve. You achieve an area of ablation. The hepatic arteries are fine. There is no vascular injury at all. Like all modalities, there are adverse effects of IRE, and which include, because of the high voltage, the transient cardiac arrhythmias, muscle contractions, transient hyperkalemia, pneumothorax, as well as venous thrombosis. This is the study that we published from PGI, looking at 21 patients of HCC and cirrhosis. So 8 were subcapsular, 10 were perivascular, and 3 were peribiliary tumors. And the range of tumor size was 14 to 40 millimeter. We found that the tumor size was significantly associated with local tumor progression-free survival when we use IRE. This is a meta-analysis again published by our group from PGI, looking at the data of IRE for malignant liver tumors. We looked at 25 studies, and in this we found that overall survival and progression-free survival at 6, 12, and 24 months for all the tumor types was 94% and say 80%. 84% and 65% and 61% and 50% respectively. But HCC was associated with a better overall survival at 12 and 36 months. So a case for HCC and IRE here. Now, if you want to compare IRE versus RFA versus microwave ablation, you're not justified doing it, because it's a direct comparison of the efficacy is not warranted, because the clinical setting in which we use IRE is actually different from where microwave ablation and RF is used. But the pooled overall survival and progression-free survival is lower than that reported for RFA and microwave ablation, that we have to acknowledge. So prospective randomized trials will be difficult to perform here. But as far as the immune response is concerned, we found that it has been reported that with IRE, there is a rise in the MIF as well as the interleukin-6 levels. So as far as looking at the cost of the ablation, if you look at the technology, if you look at microwave and RFA, almost similar. If you look at IRE, it is expensive. But here, if you look at the probes, they're also expensive too. But you are, instead of 1 probe, you're actually using 4 probes here. So at our center, we have evolved a tumor ablation model. Because we have all the ablation modalities available with us. So what we do, if it's a central lesion, a hilar lesion, we resort to IRE. And in case the patient does not tolerate general anesthesia, we use TACE here. If it's a peripherally located lesion, radiofrequency ablation. But obviously we have the alternatives in the form of IRE and TACE here as well. The rest of the liver is divided into 2 zones, the inner zone and the outer zone empirically. And those in the inner zone, because they will be closer to the blood vessels, we do not want the heat sink effect. We use microwave ablation. For those which are more at the periphery, we use the radiofrequency ablation. And if you look at the data over the last 6 to 7 years of the different modalities that we've used, you can still see that RFA was our primary workhorse, followed though with IRE here, and then microwave ablation, and then cryoablation, which we've acquired about 3 years back. So to conclude, RFA and microwave ablation are comparable techniques for ablation of hepatocellular carcinoma. Microwave ablation, definitely the in thing, but data as far as overall survival is concerned, not much different from RFA. May be preferred for lesions larger than 3 centimeter and for lesions close to blood vessel, as it achieves larger ablations and has, it has lesser heat sink effect. IRE should be preferred for hepatic hilar lesions. And I would definitely put forward this that tailored approach. That is what is required based on the experience, preference, and availability at each center. Thank you very much. And that's my email ID. In case I'm not able to answer any questions here, I'd be happy to answer them over subsequently on the email. Thank you very much. Sir, you're not audible, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kalra, for showing us so many alternatives of treating SCC lesions. And I think right now we are spoiled for choices for treating these non-surgical cases for SCC. And it's an excellent presentation. And I would now request Dr. Swain to introduce the next speaker, please. I think Dr. Swain is not here.
I think we will introduce Dr. Neeraj. Neeraj is the Director of Hepatology at Medanta.
Yeah.
And may I request Dr. Neeraj to have the presentation of pharmacological management of intermediate to advanced HCC. I think this is a follow-up of the first lecture on the molecular pathogenesis of HCC, where the treatment aspects can be coupled with the molecular pathogenesis. Dr. Neeraj.
Thank you, sir. I hope I'm audible and my slides are seen.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in the next few minutes, I'll talk of pharmacological management of advanced HCC, and we'll see whether they give us good, fruitful results or not. So where do we place systemic or pharmacological therapy in practice? So I think we all agree that systemic therapy has a place in unresectable HCC, advanced stage C, BCLC-C, portal invasion, extrahepatic spread with preserved liver function. And now there is some role of systemic therapy in intermediate stage as well, and I'll talk of that towards the end of my talk. Sunil has already shown this slide of the evolving landscape, and we know that after a long gap of almost 10 years after sorafenib was FDA approved, in the last 3 to 4 years, we have many drugs, and at present there are 8 FDA approved systemic agents available for use in HCC. And I think it's exciting times ahead in terms of systemic therapy for HCC. Now, let's look at the treatment options in the management of unresectable HCC. So there are first-line treatment options, sorafenib, lenvatinib, atezolizumab, bevacizumab combination, and again, in trial combination of pembrolizumab and lenvatinib. And then we have other drugs like regorafenib, nivolumab. Nivolumab, in case a lot of people may not know, last week has been withdrawn by BMS for indication for HCC, and this was done on behest of the FDA because the trials, the post-marketing studies have not shown good results. There are other drugs like ramucirumab and cabozantinib. So let's do a recap on sorafenib. I think we all know what we've all used sorafenib for almost a decade now. So this was the SHARP study in 2008, published in NEJM, which looked at sorafenib as the first line treatment in HCC. And this was compared to placebo. And the overall survival in the sorafenib group was 10 months, 10.7 months versus 7.9 months in the placebo. And this was a significant improvement over placebo, and this trial was stopped midway, and sorafenib was approved by FDA as first-line therapy for unresectable HCC. Now, what we have all seen over the last decade is a lot of side effects and toxicity because of sorafenib. And if you look at the common side effects, these are the hand and foot skin reaction, which is significantly more in sorafenib group as compared to placebo. Patients have anorexia, weight loss, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and all these make sorafenib a really toxic drug, and the tolerating a full dose of sorafenib has been a problem in clinical practice. So this is the real life data on sorafenib. Various trials have shown median survival ranging from 10.5 to 14.8 months. So there is good improvement in survival with sorafenib. And and these are, we must understand, a group of patients who had no other form of therapy applicable to them. So where does sorafenib stand as of today? It's the first oral drug to show survival benefit. Benefit is maximum in patients with preserved liver function. The major problem with sorafenib is adverse effects, which occur in about 30 to 50% of patients. Those who develop the hand and foot syndrome and significant diarrhea are the ones who have objective response rates, and continuing for long term at doses which least produces adverse effects is the key. Now let's look at lenvatinib, and this is almost 10 years after sorafenib was approved that lenvatinib got approved by FDA. This is the REFLECT trial, which is the non-inferiority trial, lenvatinib versus sorafenib in first-line treatment of patients with HCC. So this is a head-to-head comparison of lenvatinib to sorafenib, almost 500 patients in each group, and this study was published in Lancet in 2018. So this is the investigator assessment according to the mRECIST criteria, and overall survival of lenvatinib was better than sorafenib, 13.6 versus 12.3. The progression-free survival was better in lenvatinib, 7.4 versus 3.4. The time to tumor progression was more in lenvatinib, 8.9 months versus 3.7 months, and the overall response rate was significantly better in the lenvatinib group as compared to the sorafenib group. So lenvatinib had a statistically significant better anti-tumor effect than sorafenib. And this, if you look at the AFP, there was an imbalance in the AFP in the two groups, and AFP values were not stratified. Lenvatinib arm actually had higher patients with AFP of more than 200. And if you correct this AFP imbalance, lenvatinib demonstrated statistically significant superior effect of over sorafenib with respect to overall survival. So this REFLECT study showed that lenvatinib had a better overall survival and overall response rate as compared to sorafenib. Now, if we compare lenvatinib to other drugs, this is not in this trial, but the overall response rate as compared to other drugs, again, this was significantly better than nivolumab, sorafenib, and regorafenib. Now, coming to adverse effects, which have been the major problem with sorafenib, hypertension is a major side effect of lenvatinib, and it was significantly more as compared to sorafenib, but the hand-foot syndrome was significantly less in the lenvatinib group as compared to the sorafenib group. Proteinuria is again a complication or adverse effect of lenvatinib, which was seen in the REFLECT trial. But if you look at diarrhea, decreased appetite, fatigue, all of which are major problems with sorafenib, these are relatively less with lenvatinib as shown in this study. Now, when we talk of fruitfulness of systemic therapy, I think very important that fruitfulness is determined by two aspects. One is the overall survival or the efficacy, and the other is the adverse effects. So if you have an efficacious drug but with a lot of adverse effects, the fruitfulness will definitely not be there. So if we compare the various drugs available, lenvatinib probably has lesser side effects as compared to sorafenib and regorafenib, and this is true for most side effects like asthenia, hand and foot skin reaction, diarrhea, arterial hypertension, and rash. So to summarize lenvatinib, the REFLECT trial was the first non-inferiority trial of a molecular targeted agent, which was weight-based. It has potent anti-tumor activity as compared to previous investigational agents, better response rate, acceptable adverse effect profile, no significant impact on quality of life, and lower incidence of hand and foot reaction and diarrhea. And this actually enabled longer duration of treatment. And if the drug could be given longer, then the response rates are obviously better. Let's come to the other drug which has recently taken over as first-line therapy, atezo-bevacizumab combination. And this is a study published in NEJM last year. This is the phase 3 IM-BRAVE 150 study, which looked at this combination, the atezo-beva combination versus sorafenib in untreated patients. And this is a phase 3 open-label, multi-center randomized study. 500 patients with locally advanced HCC were studied, and the progression-free survival in this study was significantly more in the atezo-beva combination as compared to sorafenib. So 6.8 months versus 4.3 months. And the overall survival was also better for the combination as compared to sorafenib. And this drug, and again, this graph showing the median survival and the 6-month overall survival and the 6-month in the combination versus sorafenib was significantly better. The overall response rate was also better in the atezo-beva combination, 23% versus 12% in the sorafenib group. Like I showed in the first slide on this study, the progression-free survival, again, significantly more in the atezo-bev combination as compared to sorafenib. So the combination therapy also resulted in longer time to deterioration of patient and reported a quality of life and functioning better than sorafenib. Adverse effect profile in this study of this combination, again, significantly better than sorafenib. And if you can see here, the diarrhea, loss of appetite are significantly better. Hypertension is similar. And proteinuria was an adverse effect, which was more in the combination as compared to the sorafenib group. So this drug also has its share of adverse effects, but overall tolerability probably better than sorafenib in this combination. This is the keynote 524 phase 1b study of pembrolizumab plus lenvatinib in first-line unresected HCC. And this actually is a phase 1b study, and which showed very good objective response rates and overall response rates with this combination. And because of the encouraging results in phase 1b, breakthrough therapy designation was given for pembrolizumab and lenvatinib in HCC. And there is a phase 3 study which is ongoing, which is the LEAN-02 study. And this combination also appears to be promising in unresectable HCC. So we've talked about first-line treatment options. Very quickly, I'll go to a couple of second-line treatment options. This is regorafenib, which is the study which was the RESOURCE trial, which showed that if you use regorafenib after failure of sorafenib, these patients, the survival was up to 26 months as compared to 19 months in the placebo group. Another second-line drug, cabozantinib, the Celestial trial, again showing a better survival, overall survival, and progression-free survival as compared to placebo. So there are a host of drugs which show better survival as compared to placebo. So when we talk of second-line therapy, regorafenib, cabozantinib, and a monoclonal antibody ramucirumab, which has been shown to be effective in patients with high AFP. So by using first-line therapy and second-line therapy, you can get up to more than 2 years survival in this difficult group of patients with unresectable advanced HCC. Now, just last couple of slides on this new concept. So on intermediate stage HCC. So intermediate stage HCC is a very heterogeneous group. So there can be patients of class CTP class A from a score to 5 to Child's B score of 9. Tumor size can vary, tumor number can vary. So if you have, a higher number of tumors beyond the up to 7 criteria, then these patients, even though they are in intermediate stage, are sometimes unsuitable for TACE, and these are the group which turn out to be refractory to TACE. So this is a proof of concept study which was published by Kudo et al. A couple of years ago, in which they gave lenvatinib prior to TACE in this intermediate stage HCC in patients who had a high tumor burden, and there was a better survival, overall survival, and progression-free survival in the lenvatinib followed by TACE group as compared to the TACE group. So if you have a high tumor burden in intermediate stage, then this strategy can be used where you give systemic therapy first, and then you give a selective TACE with probably better results as compared to the other way around, where generally we give local regional therapy first, followed by systemic therapy. So this is the new paradigm, which we need more data in the next years to come to show whether this is really effective. But this has been accepted in the APPLE consensus statement, which is the Asia Pacific Primary Liver Cancer Group, and they recommend that targeted therapy is recommended as the first choice in treatment with subsequent local regional therapy in TACE unsuitable patients. And they say that lenvatinib, which has a good objective response rate, is a useful drug for this strategy. So to summarize, systemic therapy, is it fruitful? Well, systemic therapy is indicated in advanced unresectable HCC. Sorafenib, despite its adverse effects, has been the mainstay for almost a decade or more than a decade. Lenvatinib is now a first-line treatment with superior outcomes and better tolerability. Atezolizumab and bevacizumab has recently shown to have superior results and is a first-line therapy in unresectable HCC. Pembrolizumab plus lenvatinib is in a phase 3 study and is expected to show good results, and which should be in a first-line therapy in the next couple of years. There are a lot of second-line drugs available, but what I think is important, and what probably Sunil also said in the first talk, is that this combination of these drugs is probably the future. And if we combine these drugs according to their adverse effects and according to their mechanism of action, we can easily get more than 2 years survival in unresectable HCC. There's probably an emerging role of systemic therapy in the intermediate stage HCC as well, in TACE unsuitable patients prior to TACE. And I think this is an interesting concept, and it'll be good to see in the next few years if the data proves this. Adverse effects continue to be a major determinant in compliance and has outcomes. And so, like I said, efficacy and adverse effects will decide the fruitfulness of systemic therapy. But I think the results show fruitful results, And we are in exciting times in the next few years where a lot of drugs would be available for more use. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saraf. And as usual, very concise, crisp, and beautifully covered. May I take the liberty, with the with the permission of the organizers, to just have 3 or 4 questions, because really a session is nothing without discussion. So I'll set the ball rolling. I wanted to ask Sunil, who gave the first talk on molecular pathogenesis. Are there any established molecular markers for prognosis and for predicting response to immunotherapies, like maybe PD-1 or PD-L1 or anything else?
I think still a lot of work is going on, but at present, we don't have any molecular markers, established molecular markers, which can predict the response to treatment, except for the conventional biomarkers, which you use as alpha-fetoprotein and PIVKA. Not really. The work is still going on. I think in future, we might have some good markers.
So may I answer Dr. Soin this question? This is Ankur.
Yes. Yeah, sure.
So lots of biopsy work has been done on hepatocellular carcinoma. And they say that, so we have hepatocellular carcinoma, lymphocytic rich, neutrophilic predominant, clear cells, steatohepatitis, fibrolamellar, and the PD-L1 status by SPC, that Ventana method. So the resection rate, the transplant rate, and particularly the IMBRAVE study, which says that atezo and bev combination, it works in a lymphocytic infiltrate HCC. The reason behind it, that lymphocytic predominant HCC is an inflamed tumor, and the PD-L1 association, the anti-PD-L1 binding of atezo and the bevacizumab working is more in such tumor. So yes, we are working on these biopsies and lots of literature coming when it can be a prognostic marker as well as predictive marker to this IO and targeted therapy combination. And as Dr. Neeraj said, the Cyramza study, the ramucirumab study, where AFP for the first time has been a predictive marker. If you have a high secretor more than 400, then the Cyramza or ramucirumab worked well in a second line setting. So these biomarkers are coming up, and this is the future for hepatocellular in a metastatic setting.
Yeah, absolutely. So PD-1, PD-L1, VEGF levels, all these are to watch out for in tumors. Okay, any other questions from other panelists or chairpersons?
I have a question, Dr. Soin. So since
the audience has to type in their questions, please. There are a couple of them, but not too many. Okay, please, yeah.
Yeah, so I have a question. So since working with Dr. Subhash Gupta, and you must be having your own experience of post-transplant recurrence. So there has been no data of using these IO combination in post-transplant setting when the patient is on immunosuppression. Any experience from the panelists or the speakers? So do we rely only on TKI in post-transplant hepatocellular cancer, or we have tried IO combination in these when the patients still have Child-Pugh and the performance status is good?
So VEGF and yes, MKI or TKI are used, as you know, but ICI, that's immune checkpoint inhibitors, have been used elsewhere. We haven't used them. And elsewhere, they have found a 50% incidence of acute rejection. So generally, people, transplant community, transplant physicians stay away from ICIs post-transplant. Any others with any other experience? Right. Other questions, please? We only have like a minute now. 2 questions. Okay, if there are no more, then let me ask Dr. Gagan Saini. What about the success rate of SBRT in PVTT, that's portal vein tumor thrombosis, of various levels, like VP1, VP2, VP3, VP4, which means small veins, second order veins, first order veins, no, for the rest of them, for the first order veins and the main portal vein. So is there difference in the response rate?
They have not analyzed this sort of a response rate, but indeed, this VP1, VP2, VP3, VP4 level of portal venous thrombus is incorporated in the in one paper. It was a guideline consensus paper. So I don't have a direct answer to your question. Any portal venous thrombus should be having a 70% sort of response rate. I understand where you're coming from. because a VP1, VP2 will be a smaller thrombus and will probably be biologically more amenable to any sort of treatment, whereas a VP4 sort of a thrombus will be probably not that sensitive. We wouldn't expect it. We would expect it to be more aggressive and perhaps it's a larger volume. But then they have not really addressed it. One of the papers addresses the IVC thrombus, which is coming from a hepatocellular carcinoma, and the response rates are still about 60%. This was a slightly older paper coming from China, where they were using 3D CRT at that time, 20 sittings of 3D CRT, not SBRT. SBRT is more effective than 3D CRT.
However, so there's a question. Sorry, I'll just allow one more question from the audience. It says, and maybe Neeraj can address that. There is a rule of 7, which the Asan Medical Center people follow, which means that the size plus number should not exceed 7, size in centimeter plus number of tumors. So the question is there a role of measuring AFP in that group of patients before deciding for transplant?
Yeah, so I mean, AFP is a prognostic marker, and high AFP probably, so you're talking of transplant, right?
Yeah. So the rule of 7 is a rule that the Asan Medical Center used for choosing patients for transplantation beyond conventional criteria.
So very high AFP probably would warrant maybe downsizing prior to transplant, because to prevent higher rate of recurrence.
Yes, I would agree with that. Although the rule of 7 does not speak of AFP, but I agree that anything more than 400 has been consistently shown to have higher recurrence post-transplantation. People have 500, 1000 different levels. Okay, one more question. Post-RFA, MWA or ICA recurrence, what is the choice of therapy? Who will answer that? Maybe Dr. Kalra. Dr. Kalra?
Yeah, I'm there. Yeah, so if there's a recurrence, so that will depend on what kind of recurrence it is. If it's just a nodular recurrence around the lesion, we would definitely like to repeat that. If it's like with microwave or RFA, we would definitely repeat a microwave RFA. But in case that recurrence happens to be a kind of infiltrative recurrence, then from this ablative therapy, we might have to switch to an endovascular therapy like this. Right. So that'll depend on.
Thank you very much. One last question: what cutoff of child or male score would you use for lenvatinib, Neeraj?
So, I mean, there's the study, the REFLEX trial. Most patients are childs A. There are some of them are childs B. So, I mean, I would probably, we do end up using it because in the real world, you don't really get all those patients who don't have any bilirubin. But probably bilirubin of 3 would be my cutoff.
Right. Okay, so I'd like to thank the audience, the speakers and the chairpersons for very nice talks and participation. Maybe Dr. Anand, you can introduce the next set of moderator and panelists for them to come in. Dr. Anand there? Okay, then I'll introduce them because I don't want to waste any time. So this session is now over and we'd like to start the next session. I'd like to welcome Dr. Bhaskar Nandi as the moderator and panelists Dr. Ravi Mohanka, Dr. Ankur Bahel, Dr. Deepa and Dr. Ashish Goyal.
Good evening, sir. Thank you very much. I am Bhaskar Nandi. Am I audible?
Yes. You've lost precious time, so carry on quickly now.
Yeah, so I welcome the esteemed panelists for this discussion, join on board. We have had a very comprehensive discussion on the management of HCC, quite exciting. And usually for most of us, when we deal with HCC, we place it into our BCLC classification. And this classification also guides our treatment. But unfortunately, most of the time we are seeing advanced HCC in our country. And Most of the time, I'll end up treating either with TACE, or we now, of course, have got a lot of systemic therapy options. But over the years, definitely the landscape in HCC is changing. What has changed is, of course, better and early diagnosis. We are getting early cases now because of better surveillance. We are placing our cirrhotic patients, refinement in imaging techniques, and of course, our therapeutic options have expanded, as has been brought out by the experts just before this session. So what we propose to do is basically in the next 20 minutes or so, touch upon certain gray areas in the management of HCC and get the valuable opinion of our panelists as to how to do this, how to go about in clinical decision making as to how to manage HCC. If you take the example of this first case, it's a 60-year-old male, cirrhotic patient, alcoholic liver disease, child 7, portal hypertension, low risk varices, non-bleeder, compensated, no ascites with comorbidities and a good performance status. During routine surveillance, patient came with a space occupying lesion, diagnosed as HCC based on the classical image characteristics, arterial enhancement and a good washout. And it was placed at BCLC-A. Due to the tumor protocol, tumor board protocol at our institute, a biopsy was done. We'll discuss that why. And the biopsy had shown a metastatic neuroendocrine tumor. So while I'm aware that protocols do not get formed by surprises like this, but I think the larger question is diagnosis of HCC. Is there any room for improvement, especially for the smaller lesions? We all are aware about the pitfalls and the concerns we have in lesions which are less than 2 centimeters or even 1 centimeter. So I'd like to know from our panelists a quick opinion of them to Dr. Ashish Goel, that what protocol do you follow for your smaller lesions, and are there any markers or any techniques by which the pickup rate can be much better? That are we dealing with an HCC? Dr. Ashish?
Thank you, Dr. Nandi. Thank you to the organizers as well. I hope I'm audible, Dr. Nandi.
Yes, carry on, please.
Yeah, so the currently there are 3 CT or MRI which are cross-sectional imaging, which are sort of thought to be of equal sensitivity, specificity, and not much of difference. But so there is MRI or a functional MRI and a CT, multiphasic CT. And this is a sort of a systematic review on this, which shows that MRI and actually functional MRI is marginally more sensitive than CT. So the decision on whether to do an MRI or a CT is actually not dependent on diagnostic accuracy, maybe more dependent on expertise available and what are the safety considerations and patient preference. And AASLD and EASL guidelines currently put all of these 3 as viable options as first line. So just a word for the functional MRI, which is basically, next slide, please. This is for gadioacetate disodium, which accumulates in the hepatocytes and gives a characterization of the hepatocellular function as well, in addition to the blood flow. We must understand that less than 1 centimeter lesion, there is no current guidelines to guide us our diagnosis. But between 1 and 2 centimeters and more than 2 centimeters, definitely we can use the Leyrat's criteria. So, gadioacetate MRI, next slide, please, is basically has got a hepatocyte phase as well, which shows hypointensity in various malignancies. So if we use that hypointensity as a surrogate marker, in addition to the Leyrat's criteria, we may increase the sensitivity, but this comes at a cost of specificity. So for next slide, please. As far as contrast enhanced ultrasound, there are multiple operator dependent factors, and I wouldn't go into details for that. Next slide, please. So overall, I would think that what we do is we use multiphasic MRI with a traditional GADO contrast, and if not contraindicated, and we don't tend to use functional MRI, but we tend to use diffusion weighted imaging, which gives us essentially the same information as functional MRI and helps us in differentiating between dysplastic nodules. AFP definitely, if it is high, helps us in diagnosis. We don't use contrast enhanced
Dr.
ultrasound.
Ashish, in this particular case which I had shown, it was reported as Slirides 5 as HCC, though we had that biopsy showing us something different. Would you have done a biopsy in this case, though, of course?
Yeah, more than 2 or around 2 centimeter lesion with MRI suggesting HCC in a background of CLD, we wouldn't have done a biopsy.
You wouldn't have done. To Dr. Deepa, who is the intervention radiologist here, that can you help us in such small lesions? What are the pitfalls in Lyrides criteria, like the case that I have shown? Any precautions we need to take while we interpret these lesions and place them in Lyrides criteria?
Thank you so much once again for having me over here, and thank you organizers for this. I don't know if you have my slides over there, but then before going ahead, I just wanted to ask, what was the AFP for this patient, AFP or PIVCA?
Alpha fetoprotein was normal, PIVCA was not done.
Right, okay. I think probably the first thing that I would have done is do PIVCA, because PIVCA definitely for smaller lesions, it has got a very significant role to play, unlike AFP. And especially if AFP was normal, if we had done PIVCA, but then you're seeing an arterially enhancing lesion and we're not able to decide. I mean, obviously it was a cirrhotic liver from your slides. Yeah. So we are stuck between, we are going to think it is HCC for all practical purposes anyway. But then if the AFP is normal, that is when I would probably think, do I need to think of other tumors? Because there are a lot of other arterially enhancing tumors other than HCCs. Sometimes even some of the metastases can also be arterially enhancing, depending on the, if the primary is not, if the primary is unknown, we really don't know what it is. So
if I interrupt you here for Dr. Deepa, AFP is a marker, especially if it is quite raised, let's say more than 400. But otherwise, it is more of a, tells us about the tumor biology rather than a diagnostic marker.
Absolutely. So that is where PIVCA plays a role because, as far as the HCC criteria is concerned, either it is, 2 imaging modalities, or it is 1 imaging modality plus AFP is what is considered as the criteria for, considering something as a HCC. So if the AFP is normal, I definitely, at least at our institute, we probably would be doing PIVCA to ensure that this is not HCC, because PIVCA has got a very high sensitivity and very high specificity. AFP has got a very low sensitivity and high specificity. So that is probably the reason why, probably really doesn't make any sense doing it. But then PIVCA certainly has got a role. So if the PIVCA was not raised, then I would think twice before calling it HCC. Then, probably the role of, the PET CT can probably help sometimes if we are suspecting NETs as well, because, that is one of the differential diagnoses. Now, without deviating too much from that, from the practical issues, there are a lot of things in Lyrides. Lyrides itself is quite confusing. Although it is highly objective, it is quite confusing. One of the things that we would probably look at is obviously, can we go to the next slide? This slide may not help us. And definitely in this particular case, the patient was cirrhotic. So probably, we don't have to look at this, because Lyrides is applicable only for patients who are cirrhotic, not for patients who are less than 18 years old, or if the tumor is seen in patients with cirrhosis because of other reasons like Budd-Chiari syndrome or congenital hepatic fibrosis or HHTs, it probably has got no role there. I presume all these were excluded for this particular patient. Can we move on to the next slide? And again, this is clinical relevance of Lyrides categories. If you just look at this, the interesting thing over here is Lyrides 2. So in Lyrides 2, I think this particular patient, you categorized him under Lyrides 5. But then even in Lyrides 2, some of the patients wherein the HCC is only about 16% or so, still they ended up having malignancy. This is a histopathological to clinical correlation. So again, this is not a gold standard is what I would say. And every case is different, and we need to take in a lot of other things into consideration before we go ahead and just stick on to the Lyrides category. Can we move on to the next slide, please? And the next slide. So in Lyrides, the previous slide, it basically shows Lyrides 1, 2, 3. And what we need to differentiate here is the Lyrides M, which is the other malignancies from Lyrides 5. I think we are stuck here between LIRADS-M and LIRADS-5, how to differentiate LIRADS malignancy from the category wherein you have categorized it as LIRADS-5 is where the problem is. And this is where the ancillary features can help us a little bit. So we'll move on to the slide showing the ancillary features. Yeah, so when in doubt, this is where we are stuck. We need to look at the ancillary features. Can we move on to the next slide? So these ancillary features can help us in downgrading the HCC. So when you have actually graded it as LIRADS-5, if we have to downgrade it, some of these features may help in differentiating the malignancy and not HCC. So some of the features favoring malignancy in general are the subthreshold growth, the restricted diffusion, mild to moderate T2 hyperintensity, the fatty sparing in solid masses, iron sparing in solid mass, transitional phase hypointensity, and hepatobiliary phase hypointensity. These are all the features which favor the malignancy as opposed to HCC. Whereas those which favor the HCC in particular are, in this particular case, if we go back to the MRI and let's say all these things were present in this particular case, then it is definite HCC. But if they were not present, maybe we should just go back and look at it. Then we need to think of the other malignancies.
Yeah, I think this helps. This is factors favoring the tumor is benign.
Yeah.
If I can move on to Dr. Ankur.
Sir.
Place of biopsy in diagnostic protocol. For a long time, as gastroenterologists and oncologists had this, differences. Oncologists used to insist on a biopsy in every lesion, and we used to go by our image criteria to decide whether biopsy is required or not. We have seen the pitfall, what has happened in this particular patient. What's your opinion on this, the place of biopsy? Do we biopsy all HCCs despite our imaging characteristics, especially with the advent of systemic therapy where molecular targeted therapy is being planned?
So answer to your question will be straight away. I'll be extempo. I don't have my slide. So if the patient is cirrhotic and a typical washout, as my radiologist said, that typical washout, chronic liver disease, cirrhotic background, and high AFP, we don't like to do for biopsy. And if the patient is non-cirrhotic and alpha fetoprotein is not raised, is a multifocal disease, we have a doubt of intrahepatic cholangio, and CA 19.9 elevated, AFP being normal. Even the European Association also says that in a non-cirrhotic liver lesion, even in the presence of typical arterial and venous washout, we should biopsy more than 1 centimeter. However, American Association does not believe in that. So I would like to do a biopsy when it's a non-secretor, alpha fetoprotein is normal, and there is some atypicality in the imaging. There's a multifocal disease, and my CA 19.9 is higher because intrahepatic cholangio is very high mimicker of multifocal HCC. And at times there is a mixed pattern also of cholangiocarcinoma and hepatocellular cancer. So if my AFP is not raised, I would be having a tendency of getting a biopsy done if there's no contraindication, PT-INR and all those things favor biopsy. And your next question is advent of systemic targeted therapy. Yes, it's a research thing. It's still not in the guidelines, but all the studies, the IMbrave studies and the Keytruda studies, which have said that those patients who have a lymphocytic rich, who have a high grade, those who are beta-catenin negative on the biopsy, they actually respond to IO combination and the IO plus targeted combination, which is Pembro and lenvatinib combination, which was a huge response rate as high as stable and previous, as high as stable and a partial response rate of 90%. So systemic targeted therapy, it's an investigator tool to biopsy and correlate with the outcome. As of now, we don't need a biopsy to see whether it will be responding to IO therapy or not, irrespective of PDL status.
Dr. Ankur, even if you look at LIRAD-2 lesions, the probability of malignancy is in double digits. In 10%, LIRAD-3 is 30%. And as per the present guidelines, we follow up these lesions every 3 to 6 months. But I still feel, don't you feel that 10 to 20% is also a very high number? And can we really afford to not to intervene at that early stage? Any thoughts on that?
It's a big number, but yes, it will not change the natural course and overall survival of when you pick up these small tumors. Yes, resection and yes, RFA and microwave ablation are a therapy or even transplant in a CLD patient, but the guidelines and the practice does not say so. When you sit in the Monday morning clinic, you see cirrhotic liver, you see AFP raised, and you see a non-cirrhotic liver and AFP raise and a typical imaging. So it's a multimodality approach where we have to sit with our radiologist, gastroenterologist, and we all take a decision in the favor of patient. Yes, 10 to 20% is a high rate, but the guideline says the biopsy we have to do and we not have to do at times. So it has to be a clinical decision on clinic.
Thank you. So I think we'll move on to our next patient. This is also an alcoholic liver disease, a 40-year-old male, cirrhotic, decompensated, but though the ascites was mild, portal hypertension with portal hypertensive gastropathy with no varices, no comorbidities. There was an HCC, again classical, Lyrites 5, less than 2 centimeters, good performance status, so BCLC-A. While all the permission was sought as to how to go about, financially, follow-up over next 3 months, there was no ascites and this patient was in child's A, totally compensated. Now, how do we take this patient? Like this patient had decompensated once and now of course it's a well-preserved compensated patient. So if we approach it as a early HCC and we debate the modalities, surgical resection versus transplant versus ablation, what will you choose in this particular patient? Dr. Ravi Mohanka, we'll like to know for this particular patient, what will you do, especially keeping in mind his previous history of decompensation, the index presentation. Then he remained abstained from alcohol and after 3 months, he was fully compensated and had the small lesion. Selection of patients for resection and what will you offer for this early HCC in this particular patient?
Sure. So let me speak about the selection of patients for resection first. So in a patient who does not have cirrhosis, if it's a unilobar tumor, even with ipsilateral portal vein tumor thrombus, resection is a modality of choice. But those with cirrhosis, if they are decompensated, clearly it's not really an option. If they are compensated, like this patient who was initially decompensated and now compensated, there is a battery of investigations that we will do to tease out the degree of liver disease again. And that will involve the measures of synthetic dysfunction, measures of functional liver reserve, which will mean volumetry and ICG. And then the ICG clearance at 15 minutes, although it's available at few places in our country, but it's actually quite helpful. And we have done resections and decided on the degrees of resection based on ICG. And then as most patients would have, and everybody is familiar with measures of fibrosis, and sometimes we'll do a biopsy for that. But one of the things that is most helpful is the degree of portal hypertension. Patients who have obvious varices or splenomegaly or low platelet count are generally not going to be suitable for resection. Even those without varices or with good platelet count, we often do HVPG, and if it's less than 10, only those are the ones who will undergo resection.
Yes.
Next slide, please. So basically, now what's the destination therapy for a patient like this or another patient with cirrhosis, which may be compensated? So that will depend basically on our 3 aspects, which is whether there is an organ available for liver transplant, if that is a consideration, what's the degree of liver cirrhosis and function, and what's the risk of long-term recurrence with this tumor. So between these aspects, we would choose the one that's the most suitable, because as we know, the long-term risk of recurrence will be lowest with transplant, even though this tumor is less than 2 centimeters. Now, having said that, although so in the current UNOS criteria and other criteria all across the world, less than 2 centimeter may not be eligible for a transplant actually, because they need at least one tumor to be more than 2 centimeters in size. But then the availability is going to be a problem. So between all these options, what we work out best is going to depend not only on the imaging and the tumor characteristics and the cirrhosis characteristics or the liver function characteristics, but on a lot of other factors such as availability of transplant, what's the cost considerations, what is the risk that the family and we are willing to accept, And then what are we going to offer to the patient while the patient is waiting for a transplant if it's supposed to be a disease donor transplant? So all these aspects, considering all these aspects in this patient, I would probably consider offering either a resection or a transplant, and even a RFA for that matter, because this is a patient where the outcomes of resection versus RFA will be similar, because it's because of the size, the chances of RFA being very effective is as equal as resection. So if there is a possibility of transplant straight away, that would give them a very good chance of long-term progression-free survival or disease-free survival. The decompensation, which is proven in this case, will also get treated, and this will be best possible with a living donor transplant. But if that is not an option, then I would offer him a RFA followed by a disease donor transplant.
In this particular patient, we finally did an RFA because transplant was not feasible. But interestingly, we were not very sure about the resection aspect. So that's why this question, I thought I'll pose it to you, that patient who was previously decompensated and now here. Of course, as you said, there are many things which come into making this decision. Your liver reserve, liver functions. Dr. Ashish, any opinion on management of early HCCs? Dr. Ashish, I think you have muted yourself.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I think Dr. Mohanka has covered everything.
Just a brief comment of.
So I would think, I would agree with most of it. But once decompensated, our surgeons would be very reluctant to operate. So I don't think we would get a resection through them. It would be transplant as a first option, and while waiting for transplant, or if that is not an option, to consider RFA is what we would have thought.
This is, of course, has been covered, resectability, and this has been your approach, the slide which you had sent.
Yeah, I would agree.
You've already covered this.
Yeah, thank you.
So good. So we did RFA for this patient, and patient is still under follow-up. Coming to our third case, basically wanted to discuss in this the importance of combination therapy, like downstaging before we go for a transplant. Now, many patients are being handled in this way. It's a 56-year-old male, hepatitis B, cirrhosis, post-TVL, compensated at this point of time, 7 centimeters, slightly over 7 centimeter nodule. We did a TACE in this patient, and a transplant was planned after that. Patient lost to follow-up, came to us after about 8 months or so, and he had a good response with the TACE, as can be seen. But when he came back to us after 8 months, he had smaller lesions involving both the lobes with portal vein thrombosis. What would have been an ideal, was this a case where we could have done a tumor downstaging and then went for a transplant? Of course, that was the original plan.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so this would have been a very good case for transplant if you had prospectively planned it, and you had prospectively planned it like that. But in retrospect, now that the patient's disease has progressed despite the TACE and there is portal vein tumor thrombus, we were wiser in not going ahead with the transplant. But then the duration was 8 months, which is not typically what we would wait for after a downstaging treatment. So typically, if a patient has responded to downstaging, both in terms of the tumor markers as well as the size or M-RECIST criteria, we would still want to wait for 6 weeks to 3 months. And if at that point also the response is sustained, then these are the best patients for undergoing a transplant. This patient was obviously just beyond the UCSF criteria, but still within the up to 7 criteria. So he would have been even somebody able to be offered a straight up transplant. But then obviously in retrospect, this was an aggressive tumor. So between all the options for tumor markers, we currently follow the AFP and DCP most commonly, AFP being even more common than DCP. But the others are, except for AFP-L3, which has also been used in some centers, but most others have not had external validation to a sufficient degree, and therefore they're not in clinical use as much. But AFP and DCP, as all of us are aware, and we are in using them. But again, it depends on what cutoff you're going to use. So obviously, the sensitivity specificity will vary greatly depending on what we are looking for and what cutoff we use. If you can use the next slide, please. So this is just the extended criteria, and also here it brings out the point whether that some of the center or some of the criteria also use the tumor markers, some use AFP, some use FIVCA2. But that is an important consideration, because often we come across this question of a patient who's within the criteria, well within the criteria, but AFP is more than 1,000. What do you do with such a patient? And therefore, it would be better to use criteria which incorporate both size, number, as well as the tumor markers. Next slide, please. So most centers would now want to do downstaging and see if the patient will come into within the criteria. But and then a liver transplant obviously will not be offered if its downstaging has not succeeded. Having said that, most centers would now use an observation period of 3 months, which is also compulsory in some of the Western district allocation systems.
Yeah, in this particular patient, 8 months was a follow-up issue. It was not planned that way to wait for that long. Dr. Deepa, was TACE the best choice in this particular patient? Though for a downstaging, because our ultimate plan was to go for a transplant, or we could have used some other options, which I like you to discuss with us and guide us that how do you choose your loco-regional therapies? TACE versus TARE, or combining TACE with other modes?
So undoubtedly, TACE and TARE, I think unfortunately in India, the setting is more of, the economy-based practice. So, if the patient is not affordable, which happens in most of the cases. So TARE definitely TARE would have been a better option, but, because of a lot of other reasons, we probably wouldn't be going for TARE. So if TARE is not performed because of financial, limitations, then the next option I would have chosen for this particular patient would be TACE plus ablation. Combination therapy. TACE with combination therapy, it works wonders. It's only because in my experience and even the literature says the same thing. So any lesion which is more than 5 centimeters, TACE on itself, TACE by itself, probably doesn't result in complete resolution of the tumor. So most of the times we would see some residual disease in patients for whom we have just done TACE. So TACE plus combination therapy, TACE plus microwave ablation is what we resort to. And we do it in the same sitting. I mean, I think this slide, it's probably for bland versus chemoembolization. So you can move on further. Yeah, so the TACE plus ablation is, what I would talk about. And most of the papers, they talk about conventional TACE plus RFA, and that is for lesions less than 7 centimeters, or for, lesions which are actually smaller lesions. But when it comes to lesions which are slightly big, in fact, we have ablated tumors which are around 10 centimeters as well, combining it with a TACE treatment. And when I say this, we need to offer this in the same sitting. It's not that we ask the patient to come and do TACE in the first sitting and then go back and come back 4 weeks later for an ablation. It is in the same sitting. Patient is in the cath lab. So we use the ultrasound guidance to do the ablation, and at the same time simultaneously carry on with the TACE, because this definitely has got significant, I don't know whether you have the images that I sent across, but there are a lot of patients for whom, including the neuroendocrine tumors, that we have done a combination treatment, and the results are wonderful. And when it comes to the systemic therapies, TACE plus systemic therapies, according to the literature, undoubtedly TACE plus the sorafenib, or most of the speakers have already spoken about lenvatinib. The role of lenvatinib prior to putting these patients on TACE, subjecting these patients to TACE, definitely has got a role to play. So nowadays we've started patients on lenvatinib, and then they come back probably a couple of weeks later, after 2 to 4 weeks later, for the actual TACE treatment. That also has got a role to play. So yes, I would have done TACE plus ablation for this patient. If not, start them on the systemic therapy followed by TACE.
This newer immunotherapy is combination with TACE.
Newer yeah, and TACE and CERT, yeah. When you look at the Y90 embolization, as you all know, there is a conventional TACE and there is a drug-eluting beads, or the DEP TACE. So most of the papers, when they compared CERT to conventional TACE, there is a lot of meta-analysis comparing TACE. There is this meta-analysis, this particular patient, which talks about TARE versus conventional TACE, and wherein they said, in terms of the overall survival, there is a definite benefit of TARE compared to the conventional TACE. But when you compare TARE to DEP TACE is considered superior to TARE. So that is the difference. I don't want to confuse too much over here. So basically, compared to conventional TACE, TARE is considered superior. Whereas when we compare TARE to DEP TACE is considered superior. Again, I don't agree a lot with this particular point, only because the conventional TACE that we follow across India or across the world, there is no objective criteria for when it comes to mixing of the drug. So everybody, they have their own protocol when it comes to conventional TACE, and that is the reason why there is an operator variability, because everybody, they have their own protocol when it comes to conventional TACE, and hence that is the reason why I feel we shouldn't be comparing TARE to conventional TACE, because it is highly subjective. Whereas when it comes to DEP TACE, there is a protocol. Everybody, they have the same protocol of mixing up the drug. So the results are pretty much, it is a unified result across the world, because the DEP TACE has got a set protocol. So that is the reason why DEP TACE is considered superior to TARE when it comes to such lesions. So in this particular patient, they have done conventional TACE because I can see the lipidol deposition. So if they used a DEP TACE, probably that would have served a little better. If not, you can combine conventional TACE with microwave ablation or even radiofrequency ablation.
Yes, thank you. I think that has been, you'd like to touch on these? I think, anything? I think we are pretty much well, past our time. This is just one last question before we wind up, and it is more of a, this has been already covered by the expert speakers. Dr. Neeraj has covered it also, systemic therapy. It's more at a philosophical note, Dr. Ashish and Dr. Ankur. How much do we gain by giving systemic therapy in advanced HCC?
So in advanced HCC, when we do not have a local measure, resection is out, transplant is out, or they have relapsed systemically in various visceral organs, bone. So we have data. We started with sorafenib. We started with the SHARP trial, which was compared with placebo survival benefit. Then we have a REFLECT study which says lenvatinib is non-inferior to sorafenib. And believe me, for last 2 years, I have not written sorafenib in my practice. So lenvatinib is a huge game changer if I talk about systemic therapy. Very well tolerated, very easy dose. Hypertension can be monitored, proteinuria can be monitored. And the problem with sorafenib, when we were not able to give exact 400 milligram twice a day dose, so that problem is not happening with lenvatinib. And now if we see our practice, so what matters in systemic therapy is the performance status and the child-pook status. If we have a good patient with good child-pook status or an early B, I'm talking about B7, B8. So in child-pook A, if there is no contraindication to bevacizumab, not a esophageal varicose bleed, prothrombin time okay. So atezo and bevacizumab is my drug of choice because of the first time overall survival benefit which has been seen when this IO and targeted therapy has been compared with the TKI. But yes, we do not get these perfect patients all the time. So many times our patients are child-pook B. So in child-pook B, the guideline says, if we talk about the NCCN guidelines, the guideline says only sorafenib is suitable in child-pook A and B, and in some cases nivolumab. But we in our practice in early B7, so we give lenvatinib. They tolerate it very much, particularly our Indian patients. So if I have to choose the optimal systemic therapy upfront, it matters on child-pook status. And the combination, the IO plus targeted or the IO plus TKI, which is lenvatinib, Keytruda, or atezo plus bevacizumab, will be my drug of choice because of the response rates, which has been seen in Keytruda studies, and the response and the overall survival, as well as the DFS benefit, which IMbrave 150 gives me with this atezo and bev. But the performance status and the child-pux status matters to me the most. And we talked about biomarkers, second-line therapy, alpha-fetoprotein, regorafenib, cabozantinib. So all these drugs are freely available. And but the most important point is lenvatinib, which is a game changer in last decade. And particularly, I would not shy here to say that the generic lenvatinib has further made our life easy when we have to actually compare the generic sorafenib and the generic lenvatinib. So these are way we optimally choose systemic therapy when it comes to the patient.
Dr. Ashish, atezo and beva, you will use only for Child's A patients?
Yes.
Yeah, I would agree with most of whatever Dr. Behl has said. I would think at advanced stage it is the liver disease and the performance status, and those are the major killers. I would think when it's Child's B and Child C, it's a standard, or it's a best supportive care, which is what is required, because and we shouldn't go behind the tumor at that point of time. It really would not change the overall quality of life. But Child's A status, a big tumor, yes, maybe, but advanced tumors, I would stick to best supportive care at present.
Actually, for most of our patients, really, we get in Child's A when they come to us. This is a similar experience for you? As far as advanced HCC in Child's A, do you see them often?
No, we do see a lot of patients where we are actually offering best supportive care.
Yeah. I think we will stop here. The purpose of this discussion was to touch upon certain gray areas and get real world experience from our expert panelists as to how do they manage the cases in their centers. I hope we have been successful in that. I thank all the panelists for their valuable opinions. Thank you very much. Over to the chairperson.
Thank you.
I think we've come to an end of a wonderful session, and I want to thank all the speakers, the chairpersons, the moderators, and the panelists of this session. And I also want to thank the audience who have been very actively participating in this session. This academic feast is still not over, and it's going to continue over the next 2 days. And I request all of you to join tomorrow again at the same time. And we have some wonderful state-of-art lectures tomorrow. And we also have the plenary session and poster sessions, and a lot of case-based discussions, and some very interesting case-based discussions by Dr. Soin, and discussions on ACLF, HCCs, and so on. So I request all of you to join tomorrow again. And at the end, I also want to thank the technical team for the technical support and a flawless session we had. Thank you all for your active participation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.